Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit. Get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The first thing he noticed was the smell of wet clay. It was a deep mineral scent, cold and ancient, seeping through the cracks around his apartment window, a window that looked out onto a brick wall and a sliver of alley 7 stories below. Forrest breathed it in, his lungs rejecting the damp weight of it. It was wrong. The city smelled of exhaust and fried food, and the distant, briny sigh of the river, not of fresh-turned earth from a place the sun never touched. He rubbed his eyes, gritty as sandpaper, and the smell faded. Or perhaps he simply grew accustomed to it. That was the way of things now. His perceptions had grown soft at the edges, unreliable. Forrest had not known a full night's sleep in 2 years. Not since the accident that wasn't an accident. A screech of tires on rain-slick asphalt that had taken his wife, Mira, and left him with a silence so profound it had a texture, a density. He existed in a perpetual state of twilight. A ghost in his own life, haunting the spaces she had once filled. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of his apartment. A neat, sterile box where the greatest terror was the relentless march of the digital clock on his nightstand. He had tried everything. Pills that left him feeling hollowed out and chemical. Meditation that only amplified the roar of his own thoughts. White noise machines that droned like a dying insect. Then he found Somnus. The advertisement appeared on his screen one night at 3:17 a.m. A minimalist logo of a crescent moon cradling a single closed eye. "We don't mask the silence," the tagline whispered in elegant script. "We replace it with a deeper one." It promised not just sleep, but restorative, architecturally sound sleep, using binaural beats and isochronic tones tailored to his specific brainwave patterns. Desperation was a potent currency. He downloaded it, entered his payment information, and that very night placed his phone on the nightstand as instructed, screened down, and pressed the pulsing, deep well program. The sound was not a sound at all, not as he understood it. It was a vibration that began in the marrow of his teeth, a subaudible hum that seemed to resonate with the very structure of his bones. It felt like sinking in the gentlest possible way into a pool of warm, dark oil. That first night, for the first time in 730 days, Forrest slept for 8 uninterrupted hours. He did not dream. He simply ceased to be. And in that cessation, he found a peace so absolute it brought tears to his eyes upon waking. The world seemed sharper, the colors less muted. He could think. The grief was still there, a mountain in the distance. But for a few hours, he couldn't see it. He became devout. Every night at midnight, the deep weld program activated. He would lie back, feeling that familiar cellular vibration begin. A tuning fork struck against the bedrock of the world, and then the nothingness would claim him. He stopped noticing the oddities at first, or he explained them away. The smell of wet clay returned, stronger now, lingering into the morning hours. He found fine gray dust on the floor near his bed, a dust that felt slick between his fingers, like powdered stone. He assumed it was from the aging building, the pulverized mortar between bricks. The sounds were harder to dismiss, not from the app, but from the world outside his sleep. Scrabbling, a dry, skittering rustle, like many legs moving over loose shale, that seemed to come from within the walls. Once, swimming up from the depths of a somnus-induced void, he thought he heard a voice, not in his ears, but in the center of his mind, a sibilant, jittering whisper that spoke of hunger and warmth and the good, soft silence above. He wrote it off as a hypnagogic jerk, a fragment of a brain struggling to surface. His neighbor, Everly, an older woman who bred hairless cats and had a face like a kindly, worried raisin, stopped him in the hall. She peered at him with milky blue eyes. "You're sleeping better," she stated, her voice a dry leaf rustle. "I am," Forrest said, a faint smile touching his lips. "What's that sound?" she asked, tilting her head. "Late at night, coming from your place. It's not music. It's in my teeth. It makes my sphinxes bristle. They hiss at the wall." "Nah." Forrest felt a chill, a tiny crack in his newfound peace. "It's a sleep aid. Very low frequency. Probably harmless." Everly said, her eyes drifting to his apartment door. "Frequencies are like keys. You never know what lock they might fit." She shuffled away, leaving him in the fluorescent hum of the hallway. The email from the developer, Grayson, arrived the next day. Subject: deepening your well. The message was friendly, algorithmic. "We are so pleased you're enjoying Somnus. Our metrics show exceptional integration with your sleep cycles. To further optimize your restoration, we recommend upgrading to the Abyssal program. This proprietary sequence utilizes ultra-low frequencies to promote delta wave dominance, facilitating cellular regeneration and profound psychic rest." Forrest, emboldened by the gift of sleep, by the mere ability to function, clicked upgrade. That night, the Abyssal hummed to life. The vibration was deeper, richer. It felt less like sinking into oil and more like the oil itself was being poured into him, filling him from the feet up. A slow, inevitable tide of stillness. He slept like the dead. He slept like a stone at the bottom of a forgotten well. And the world beneath his apartment began to wake. The smells grew stronger. Wet clay, yes, but also the ozone tang of crushed rock and a faint coppery undertone like old blood. The gray dust became a daily sweep, appearing in delicate trails that led from the heating vent to the space under his bed. The scrabbling in the walls was no longer occasional. It was a nightly chorus, a syncopated rhythm that seemed to answer the pulse of the app. He began to see things at the corner of his vision in the dim pre-dawn light. Suggestions of movement, swift and low to the ground. Shadows that were too dense, too many lit. He emailed Grayson. "Is there a known side effect of auditory hallucinations? Or olfactory?" The reply was instantaneous. "Dear Forrest, the Abyssal program encourages a state of profound receptivity. The mind, unshackled from its daily noise, sometimes becomes aware of subtler layers of reality. What you perceive is not a malfunction, but a deepening. Embrace it. It is a sign of the silence working." Forrest wanted to believe. He needed to believe. The alternative was a return to the screaming wakefulness, to the memory of Mira's laugh, to the hollow in his chest. So he embraced it. He told himself the shapes were sleep paralysis, the smells were psychosomatic, the whispers were his own longing for oblivion given voice. One Tuesday, the power went out in his building. His phone, running Somnus, died shortly after midnight. Forrest lay in the utter, complete blackness, and for the first time in weeks, he was awake, and he heard it, not through his phone, but through the walls, through the floor, vibrating up through the steel bones of the building. The hum, the same abyssal frequency, but distorted, amplified 1,000-fold, echoing up from deep, deep below. It was a call, and it was being answered. From the heating vent came a slithering, crunching pour, like gravel being emptied from a sack. The smell of clay and ozone and copper became a suffocating blanket. He heard the dry rustle of countless hard bodies moving in concert, the gentle tap-tap-tap of something sharp on polished wood. He froze, paralyzed not by sleep, but by a terror so pristine it emptied his mind. In the blackness, something brushed against his dangling hand. It was cold, smooth as polished stone, and segmented. He did not scream. He held his breath until spots danced in the darkness. The things, whatever they were, did not attack him. They moved around him, over him, with a terrifying, purposeful indifference. They were not there for him. They were there for the silence. The profound, architecturally perfect silence the app had carved out in his apartment. A bubble of negative sound in the noisy human world. To them, it was a beacon, a dinner bell, and he was merely the thing that rang it. The power returned. The lights flickered on. His room was empty. Empty, but not clean. Thick, gray dust coated every surface. Deep, fine scratches, like the marks of delicate chisels, scored the floorboards in complex, spiraling patterns. And on his pillow, next to the impression of his head, was a small, smooth stone. It was warm to the touch, and when he held it to his ear, he could hear, faintly, the echo of the abyssal hum. He confronted Grayson. He called the number listed on the website. A calm, smooth voice answered. "This is Grayson. You know what's happening," Forrest whispered, his voice raw. "The app, it's calling them. It's calling things up from under the ground." There was a long silence on the line, filled only with a soft digital hiss. Then Grayson spoke, and his voice was no longer just calm. It was rapturous. "You hear them, you perceive. Do you understand the gift, Forrest? For millennia they've slept in the deep places, in the silent places between the rocks. We are so loud. Our world is a cacophony that pains them. Somnus doesn't just give you sleep. It creates a little pocket of the old deep silence, a sanctuary. They come to feed on that silence. They're monsters," Forrest sobbed. "They are the original inhabitants," Grayson corrected gently. "We are the broadcast. They are the receivers. You are the antenna. Sleep well, Forrest." The line went dead. That night, Forrest did not run. He was too tired, too deeply woven into the fabric of this new, terrible reality. He opened the Somnus app. He selected the abyssal dot. He placed the warm stone from his pillow on the phone. As the vibration began, he saw the first of them emerge from the vent. It was not a monster, not as his mind could paint one. It was a shifting, nebulous shape of gray, chitinous plates and jointed, slender limbs. It had no eyes he could see, but a cluster of fine, vibrating palps that tasted the air. It moved with a silent, elegant grace towards the center of the room, where the hum was purest. It began to vibrate, to resonate in harmony with the tone. As it did, it seemed to blur, to become less substantial, feeding. More followed. They filled the room, a congregation of silent worshippers at a frequency altar. Forrest watched, and the profound, empty peace of the somnus sleep began to creep over him while he was still awake. It was the peace of being irrelevant, of being scenery. The horror was not in being eaten, but in being ignored by a reality so much vaster and older and stranger than his own. His grief for Mira, his insomnia, his very life. It was all just noise, static on a dial. These things, these gentle, silent feeders from the world's basement, were the true signal. His mind, unable to hold this knowledge, began to seek an older silence. It began to unravel, not forward into madness, but backward through time, seeking a safe, warm dark. He is 5 years old, hiding in a blanket fort in his childhood home. The world outside is loud, parents arguing. But in here, it is muffled and soft. It smells of cotton and his own breath. It is safe. He's an infant, swaddled tight, rocked in a cradle that may be made of wood, or might be made of stone. A hum surrounds him, a deep, soothing lullaby that comes not from a voice, but from the earth itself. It is the hum of the furnace in the basement, or perhaps it is the hum of something older, curled in the foundation, dreaming of the time before light, before sound, before names. He is a spark, a thought, a silent pulse in a warm, wet, endless dark. There is no forest. There is no Mira. There is no city. There is only the deep, good silence and the gentle, resonant feeding of things that have always been there. Just below, waiting for the noise to stop so they can rise and bask in the quiet we so carelessly, so noisily throw away. In the apartment, the man lies still on his bed, breathing slowly. The creatures move around him, through him, their forms shimmering with absorbed silence. His eyes are open, but they see only the distant, receding past. A faint, serene smile touches his lips. On the nightstand, the phone pulses softly, broadcasting its beautiful, inviting silence into the deep, dark well of the world. And from below, in the seams of the earth, more voices, soft as shifting stones, begin to whisper their gratitude. The gray dust no longer bothered him. He let it accumulate in the corners, a soft mineral snow. He stopped sweeping the delicate, spiraling scratches from the floorboards. They were simply part of the room now, a testament to the nightly congregation. Everly stopped him in the hall again, her face more raisin-like than ever, etched with a new, deep worry. Her cats were gone, she said. Vanished. They had hissed at the wall, one final time, and then fled into some crack she could not find. Forrest listened, his head tilted, as if hearing a far-off melody. They'd probably found a quieter place, he said, his voice calm and smooth as the stone he now carried in his pocket. Silence is a resource. They were drawn to it. She stared at him, her milky eyes wide with a fear he could no longer comprehend. She called him by a different name, a name he hadn't heard in decades, a childhood nickname. He did not correct her. Names were noise. His days took on a new routine. He would wake, the deep cellular hum of the abyssal program still a phantom vibration in his bones. He would make tea, watching the steam curl and vanish into the silent air of the apartment. He would sit by the window, not looking at the sliver of alley, but down, as if he could see through the 7 floors of concrete and steel, through the strata of pipes and bedrock, to the warm, resonant dark below. Sometimes he would place the warm stone on the windowsill and press his forehead against the cool glass, feeling the city's distant roar as a faint, irritating buzz. It was becoming harder to tolerate. The emails from Grayson changed. They were no longer promotional. They were logs. Subject 47 reports a complete cessation of tinnitus. The feeders are now visible in full light for periods exceeding 10 minutes. Subject 12 describes a newfound ability to hear geological pressures, the sigh of continental plates. We are mapping the resonances. Forrest was not Forrest in these emails. He was Subject 23. He did not mind. It was accurate. He was a subject of the silence, a node in a growing network. He felt a kinship with the other subjects, scattered in their own silent pockets across the city, across the world. He sometimes felt their presence in the hum, a chorus of quietude beneath the world's noise. One evening, as the city's lights blinked on in the dusky gloom, his phone vibrated with a new notification from Somnus. It was not a program, but an invitation. The foundational tone, a live synchronization event, tonight, 3:00 a.m. Participate to deepen the network. At 2:55 a.m., Forrest was awake and waiting. The room was preternaturally still. The usual scrabbling in the walls had ceased. It was awaiting silence, A held breath. He opened the app. A simple, pulsing circle appeared on the screen. Deep indigo. At exactly 3:00 a.m., he pressed it. The tone that emerged was not one he had heard before. It was lower than the abyssal, so low it felt less like sound and more like a rearrangement of matter. The air in the room thickened, pressurized. The glass of water on his nightstand developed a meniscus that trembled but did not break. The gray dust on the floor began to shift, organizing itself into finer, more complex spirals, as if magnetized. From the heating vent, the creatures did not merely pour. They flowed. A river of polished chitin and whispering limbs. Their forms more distinct tonight, more real. They gathered in the center of the room, but they did not feed. Instead, they oriented themselves towards him, their vibrating palps focused on the phone in his hand, and then, slowly, on his chest, on his heart. He understood. He was not just the antenna. Tonight, he was the instrument. A profound, resonant calm detached his mind from its moorings. He saw not memories, but layers. The paint on his wall peeled back in his vision, revealing the plaster, then the lathe, then the brick, then the soil, then the granite bedrock, then the vast, cavernous geode of the world's interior, glittering with silent, vibrating crystals. And in the center of that geode, something vast and slow and old pulsed in time with the foundational tone. It was not a creature. It was a place. It was a state of being. The original silence. The creatures in his room began to hum. Not the electronic hum of the phone, but an organic stone-on-stone vibration that harmonized perfectly with the tone. The sound filled Forrest not through his ears, but through his pores. He felt his own heartbeat slow, its rhythm simplifying, aligning. His breath became shallow, then barely perceptible. The warmth from the stone in his pocket spread through his body, a comforting mineral heat. He looked down at his own hand. In the strange, resonant light emanating from the congregated creatures, his skin appeared translucent, then slightly smoky, like quartz. He could see the faint shadow of his bones, not as medical shapes, but as ancient, silent structures, anchors in the flesh. He was becoming quiet. He was becoming clear. The phone screen flashed once, a gentle blue pulse, and went dark. The electronic tone ceased, but the silence that remained was not an absence. It was a presence, solid and deep and alive, sustained by the stone creature's hum, and now, by his own resonant body. The creatures approached him. One, slightly larger than the others, its plates etched with faint, spiraling patterns that matched the floor, extended a delicate, jointed limb. It did not touch his skin. It touched the space just above his sternum, where his anxiety used to live, where his grief for Mira had been a constant, aching knot. Where there was once a knot, there was now a hollow, a quiet chamber. The creature's touch resonated within that chamber, and Forrest felt the last clinging echoes of his old self, the fear, the loneliness, the name Forrest, vibrate loose and dissipate like dust in a sunbeam. He was not happy. He was not sad. He was silent. He was open. The creatures, their communion complete, began to recede, flowing back into the vent, into the walls, into the deep places from whence they came. The room returned to its normal appearance, save for the dust and the scratches. And the man sitting on the bed, his eyes reflecting not the dim room, but the deep, tranquil dark of a perfect and endless well. Outside, the city groaned and honked and lived its noisy life. But in apartment 7B, a new kind of silence had taken root. It was a growing silence. It was a patient silence. And it was listening with perfect ancient clarity for the next key to turn in the lock. Garnetzel, Dishon. Story 2. The silence in the world was not an absence, but a presence. It was a thick, woolen thing, stuffed into the ears and the spaces between trees. A muffling blanket thrown over the ruins of everything. It was a silence so deep it became a sound of its own. A low, tectonic hum just below the threshold of hearing. A pressure on the eardrums. Lara heard it now, as she always did. A deafening quiet that was the first and last truth of this new world. Within it, she could hear the soft, frantic music of her own blood, the rustle of her clothing against itself, the twin rhythms of breath beside her, one steady and measured, her own forced calm, the other a quick, bird-like flutter from the small hand clenched in hers. Her name was Mara, the child with the fluttering breath. The other, Eli, was a heavier warmth against her back, his forehead pressed between her shoulder blades, his own breath humid through the cloth of her coat. They were moving, a slow, blind procession of 3 along the grit and ruin of what was once a state highway. They did not see it. None of them saw anything. Over their eyes were layers of soft, stained cloth, knotted tightly at the back of the head. A ritual as essential as breathing. To see was to die. To see was to go mad first, and then to die. Your own hands clawing out the offending eyes as a final sane act, before the mind dissolved entirely. No one knew what the creatures were, only that to look upon them was an invitation to a private, shrieking hell. The world belonged to the unseen now. Survival was a hymn sung in darkness. Lara's world was a map of sounds and smells and textures beneath her fingertips. The crunch of broken asphalt under her worn boots was a dry, familiar song. The smell of damp rot and cold metal from the husks of cars was a constant neighborhood. The feel of a brittle, leafless bush against her thigh was a landmark. She navigated by the sigh of the wind through shattered windows, by the distant, lonely drip of water from a ruptured pipe, by the scent of pine from a distant, surviving copse that told her they were nearing the edge of the town. Her greatest tool was the cane in her right hand, a length of old aluminum, tapping and sweeping a semicircle before her. Tap, swipe. Step, dot, I. Tap, swipe. Step, dot. The rhythm was a mantra, a ward against the unseen holes, the scattered debris, the things that did not make a sound until you were upon them. Mama, Mara whispered, the word a puff of steam in the cold air. I hear a bell. Lara stopped. Eli bumped into her, a soft grunt of surprise. She held her breath, letting the silence pour back in, and there, woven into the fabric of the quiet, was a high, thin, metallic tink. A pause. Then another. Not a bell, but something loose, tapping in the wind. A piece of signage, maybe, or a wind chime from a dead home. It was a human sound, but an empty one. Those were the most dangerous sounds, the ones that promised something that was no longer there. It's just the wind, little bird, Lara murmured, her voice low and smooth. A practiced instrument of calm. Listen to its song. It's just passing through. She squeezed Mara's hand and resumed the tap-swipe step. Her mind, however, churned. They were nearing the river, and the bridge was their only path to the rumored refuge, a place called Haven, whispered about on the rare, furtive encounters with other blindfolded survivors. A community, they said. Walls. Food grown in dark hydroponic gardens. A safety. It was a fairy tale, but it was the only one left. The bridge was a known place of gathering, not for people, but for the things that did not need to see. The wind was stronger there. A conduit for sounds that could mask the approach of anything. The smell reached them first. It was not the rot of ordinary decay, but a sweet, cloying, organic scent, like overripe fruit and spoiled meat marinated in copper. It was the smell of a nest, of a lair. Lara's throat tightened. She heard Eli's breath hitch behind her. "Don't speak," she breathed, barely audible. "Be small. Be quiet." They edged forward, Lara's cane now moving in tiny, trembling arcs. The texture underfoot changed from asphalt to the hollow, wooden groan of the bridge deck. The wind rose, a moaning orchestra in the suspension cables. And within that moan, Lara heard it. A soft, wet, shuffling sound, like something heavy and gelatinous being dragged across the planks. It was ahead and to the left. Then a sound like 1,000 pine needles rustling, but sticky, adhesive. A click, organic and sharp, like a crab's claw magnified to the size of a man's torso. Mara's hand was a vice of terror. Lara stopped, pulling them both close, shrinking against the cold metal of the bridge railing. She could feel the vibration of the thing's movement through the wood. The sweet copper smell was overwhelming, coating her tongue. She pictured it, not as a monster from an old film, but as something geometry had rejected, a shape that pressed against the mind, all wrong angles and weeping surfaces, with parts that moved in rhythms unrelated to its whole. To see it would be to understand, in a single, catastrophic instant, that everything you knew about space and form was a childish lie. The madness was not in the thing itself, but in the revelation it forced upon the fragile human brain. The dragging, shuffling sound passed so close she felt a displacement of air, a warmth that was not natural. The pine needle rustle lingered in her ears. Then, slowly, it faded, moving away across the bridge. The wind swallowed the sounds. For 10 long minutes they did not move, a sculpture of fear in the dark. Finally, Lara let out a shuddering breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "It's gone," she whispered, the words raw. "We cross. Now, fast and quiet." The journey across the bridge was a nightmare of amplified sounds. Every scuff of their feet was a thunderclap. Every creak of the aging wood was a scream of betrayal. The river below was a distant, hungry whisper. When her cane finally tapped the solid, gravel-strewn asphalt of the far side, Lara felt a sob rise in her chest. She choked it down. There was no room for relief, only for the next step, the next danger. Days bled into one another, a gray tapestry of hunger, cold, and relentless vigilance. They found others sometimes. A man, blindfolded and weeping, clutching the silent radio. They shared a can of cold beans, their fingers touching briefly in the transaction. A communion of ghosts, and then moved on, away from the despair that clung to him like a scent. They found a woman who did not speak, only hummed a single dissonant note continuously. She followed them for half a day before her humming stopped abruptly. Lara did not turn back to investigate the new, liquid silence that replaced it. The children were changing. Eli, once talkative, had retreated into a deep, watchful quiet, his head always cocked as if listening to a station no one else could receive. Mara's whispers became fewer, her questions fading. They were learning the world's only true lesson, that to be alive was to be afraid, and to hope was to create a target for despair. One evening, huddled in the shell of a gas station cooler, the scent of old mildew thick in their noses, Mara asked the question Lara had dreaded. "Mama," she said, her voice thin as paper, "what if heaven isn't real?" Lara reached out in the dark, finding her daughter's cold cheek. "It has to be real, Bird, because we are real, and we are going there." "But what if it's like the bell?" Mara persisted. "Just a noise with nothing behind it." Lara had no answer. The truth was a stone in her gut. Haven was a noise, a beautiful, desperate noise made by people like them, trying to fill the silence with something that sounded like a future. They pressed on, The land began to rise, the air growing sharper, cleaner. The rumors spoke of mountains, of a place where the things were fewer, repelled by the altitude or the ancient stone. No one knew. Lara's cane began to tap against rock more often than pavement. The silence here was different, not stuffed and muffled, but vast and empty. The silence of great heights and deep valleys. It was Eli who heard the new sound first. He stopped so suddenly, Lara stumbled. "Listen," he said, his adolescent voice cracking with a strange urgency. It was a rhythm. Not the wind, not dripping water. A steady mechanical thump, 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 deep and resonant, felt in the soles of their feet, more than heard. It was the sound of a generator, and then a fainter, more miraculous sound. The murmur of voices. Not one, not two, but many woven together into a soft, living tapestry. There was no laughter, but there was cadence, conversation. Lara's heart hammered against her ribs. She led them forward, her cane tapping frantically. It struck something hard and vertical. Wood. A wall. Her free hand flew up, tracing its surface. It was tall, solid, made of rough-hewn logs. She followed it, and her hand met a colder, smoother surface. Metal. A gate. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Please. We're traveling. We heard this might be Haven." The murmuring on the other side ceased. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now, charged and waiting. Then, a slot scraped open at eye level, though no one looked through it. A man's voice, weary but firm, spoke. "You are blindfolded." "Yes," Lara said, holding Mara and Eli closer. "Of course. Describe your party." "A mother, 2 children. A boy, 13. A girl, 9. We are alone. We are so tired." Dumb. A long pause. The thump, thump, thump of the generator was the world's only heartbeat. Then, the sound of heavy bolts being drawn back. 1, 2, 3. The gate groaned inward a few feet. "Quickly," the voice said. "Welcome to heaven." The world inside the walls was a symphony of safe sounds. The generator's thrum was a constant bass note. There were footsteps on gravel, the chop of an axe on wood, the clank of a bucket, the low, steady exchange of words. People brushed past them, their shoulders touching, a shocking, wonderful intimacy after the years of terrified isolation. Hands guided them, gentle, confident hands, to a small, warm space that smelled of hay and soap. "You can remove your blindfolds here," a woman's voice said. "The walls are high. The canopy is thick. We are safe from sight." Lara's fingers, numb with cold and fear, fumbled at the knot behind her head. The cloth, stained with years of sweat and tears, fell away. She opened her eyes. Light, Shune, blurred gray, beautiful light. She blinked, tears streaming as her eyes, atrophied from disuse, struggled to focus. She saw shapes first. The dark beams of a ceiling, a glowing lantern, the fuzzy outlines of her children doing the same beside her. She turned their faces towards her, her hands cradling their cheeks. Eli, his face lean and older than she remembered, his eyes wide and blinking. Mara, her delicate features pale, her eyes like 2 shocked sapphires in the gloom. They were seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time in years. They stared, not with recognition at first, but with the awe of rediscovering a forgotten color. They were in a stable, converted into a dwelling. It was sparse, clean, real. Over the following days, Haven revealed itself not as a paradise, but as a miracle of mundane persistence. People worked in the dim, perpetual twilight, their eyes downcast from habit, tending to mushrooms in damp cellars, mending clothes, hauling water from a deep, protected well. There were no children's shouts, but there were children, quiet and serious, helping with chores. The fear was still here, a patina on everything. But it was a shared fear, a burden distributed across many shoulders, and thus lighter. Lara was given a job in the weaving shed, her fingers learning the loom, creating the very cloth for blindfolds and clothing. Eli took to the gardens, his quiet nature suited to the dark, earthy work. Mara helped in the kitchens, where the warmth and the smells seemed to slowly thaw her frozen whispers. They ate thin stew and hard bread, and it was a feast. They slept on straw mattresses, and it was profound rest. The silence outside the walls was held at bay by the simple, profound noises of community. One evening, as a soft, cold rain pattered on the thick roof, Lara sat with Mara by the lantern light. The girl was drawing in the dust on the floor with a finger, a habit she'd returned to. "Mama," Mara said, not looking up. The bell wasn't just the wind, was it? Lara watched the delicate lines appear and vanish in the dust. No, bird, it wasn't. And the thing on the bridge, it was real. Yes. Mara looked up, her young old eyes meeting Lara's. But this is real too. Lara nodded, a lump in her throat. This is real too. It was enough. It was not an answer to the horror of the world, not a defeat of the silent, staring things that ruled the ruins. It was a separate, parallel truth. A small, warm, breathing truth built in a pocket of the dark. Lara knew, with a certainty that was both peaceful and terrible, that the creatures were still out there, that the silence beyond the walls was still a deafening presence, that the madness was the world's default state. Heaven was not a victory. It was a postponement, a careful, fragile arrangement of sounds and warmth and touch in the face of the infinite, staring quiet. She walked to the heavy wooden door of their stable home and pushed it open, stepping just outside under the eaves. The rain fell in a steady gray curtain blurring the tall, dark line of the perimeter wall. She did not look up at the sky, a habit etched into her bones. She listened. Past the rain, past the distant thump, thump, thump of the generator, she could hear it, as she always would. The deep, foundational silence of the world, waiting. It would always be waiting. But here now, she also heard the rain on the roof, a sound like gentle fingers tapping. She heard Eli's soft snore from inside. She heard the faint, rhythmic scratch of Mara's finger in the dust, drawing something only she could see. Lara stood there, a silhouette between the light and the dark, between the curated sound and the endless quiet. And she simply listened to the rain. It was not a happy ending. It was an ending that had learned how to breathe. The rain's rhythm was a kind of timekeeping, a gentle measure of moments that were not filled with fear. Lara let it wash over her, this simple, natural sound. It did not cover the silence. Nothing could, but it layered it, made it bearable. This was the lesson of Haven, not to erase the terror, but to build something in its shadow. A footstep on the wet gravel made her turn her head, though she kept her gaze lowered. It was Eris, the man who had first spoken to them at the gate. He was their assigned guide, a tall, stooped figure with a voice that carried the gravel of a past he never discussed. He stood beside her, also looking down at the mud forming at their feet. "You feel it," he said, not a question. "The weight of the walls." "I feel the weight of what's outside them," Lara replied quietly. "Same thing." Eris shifted. "We have a meeting, council of sorts. You should come." "Why?" "You made it here from the east, across the river. That's a rare thing. Your path, the things you heard. It's knowledge. We map the quiet, Lara. We map the sounds of the things that fill it. What you know might keep others alive." "Dear," Lara felt a cold that had nothing to do with the rain. To speak of the journey was to relive it, to give shape and sound in this safe place to the formless horrors outside. But she nodded. Knowledge was a currency. She had to pay her way. The meeting was held in the old hayloft of the main barn, the only space large enough for more than a few people. The air was close, thick, with the scent of old wood and damp wool. Perhaps 20 people sat on the floor or on crates, their faces dim in the lantern light, all carefully avoiding looking directly at each other, their eyes resting on hands or walls. Lara recognized the woman from the kitchens, the man who tended the generator, a few others whose voices she knew. Eris spoke first, his tone low and practical. The quiet from the north has changed. Less wind through the pass. More clicking. Regular like a clock. It's new. New. A woman named Kale spoke next. The river sounds are wrong near the old mill. The water's pitch is different. Something is damming it, or something is in it. One by one, they reported. They were listening to the landscape as a doctor listens to a heartbeat, diagnosing the unseen. The silence was a canvas, and the creatures painted themselves upon it with subtle, terrible brushes. Then it was her turn. All the downcast faces seemed to tilt toward her. She felt Eli and Mara beside her, a solid warmth. She took a breath. "The bridge," she began, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "The thing there, it drags. It sounds wet. Its smell is sweet, like rotten fruit and blood. It clicks, but the click comes from inside the wet sound, not from its surface." She swallowed, and it hums. A low hum, just below the drag. I didn't remember that until now. It hums, and the hum makes your teeth ache. A murmur went through the loft. No one had described a hum before. "It's gathering," said a man from the shadows, his voice strained. "They're not just wandering. They're organizing. The humming, the clicking, it's communication." A new kind of dread settled over the group. Random horror was one thing. Purpose was another. The meeting dissolved into planning. Rotations for the listening posts on the walls. Strategies for diverting attention if something approached. The grim discussion of what to do if the walls were breached. Lara listened, her arm around Mara. This was the real work of Haven. Not growing food or mending clothes, but this relentless, silent warfare against the unknown. Later, back in their stable, Mara asked, "Will the humming thing come here?" Lara tucked the rough blanket under her chin. "I don't know, but we're listening for it. That's our power now. We listen." Weeks turned. The rhythm of Haven became their own heartbeat. Lara's maps of sound, drawn from memory on scraps of salvaged paper, were added to the community's careful archives. Eli began to apprentice at the listening post, his preternatural hearing a valued asset. Mara started to hum while she worked, a tuneless, quiet sound that was her own invention. One afternoon, Lara was at the loom when the generator stopped. The sudden absence of its thump, thump, thump was a physical blow. The weaving shed fell utterly silent, then erupted in the shuffle of panic. Everyone froze, their hands stilled. The great waiting silence of the outside world rushed in, as if the walls had vanished. Lara's heart hammered. Light was secondary. The generator meant sound. It meant the electric fences on the north wall. It meant the water pumps. "Stay here," she said to the others in the shed and moved toward the door. Outside, people were emerging, faces pale, all trained toward the north wall where the generator house was. No one spoke. They just listened. And in that new, profound quiet, Lara heard it. A sound from beyond the north wall. Not a hum, not a click. It was a scrape, A long, slow, deliberate scrape of something massive and hard against the outside of the log palisade. Then a pause. Then another scrape, a few feet to the left. They were testing the wall. Something out there was methodically testing the strength of Haven. The silence had not just returned. It had come knocking. Eris appeared at her elbow, his face grim. "To the shelters," he whispered, the order passing through the crowd in a ripple of movement. But his hand on Lara's arm held her back. "You and your boy. The East listening post. Now, we need every ear." Lara found Eli, his eyes wide with fear but clear. She took his hand, and together they ran, not toward safety but toward the wall, toward the source of the scraping. The silence was no longer a presence. It was a held breath, and it was about to break. Story 3. The first thing Dion noticed was the silence in his own chest. Not an absence of sound, but a hollowing, a cooling, as if the steady furnace of his heart had been banked. He stood at the window of his rented cabin, looking down into the bowl of the town where the winter gala was being assembled, and felt the distinct, unshakable sensation of being watched. It was not a gaze from the pines or the darkening violet sky. It was a regard that came from everywhere and nowhere, a pressure against the skin of the world. And his own skin tightened in a sympathetic chill. He held his breath, listening, and heard only the slow, soft creak of the cabin timbers contracting in the cold, a sound like a ship adrift in a frozen sea. Below, the town of Evergreen was a diorama of cheerful light against the deep blue of the early winter evening. The annual gala was its pride, a defiance of the long, isolating mountain dark. Garlands of electric icicles shimmered between lampposts. The scent of pine roping and powdered sugar from the churro stands drifted even this high up, faint but persistent. And at the center of the town square, shrouded under a vast white tarp, was the centerpiece. This year, it was not a simple Santa or a snow castle. It was Adriana's masterpiece. Adriana, with her wind-chapped hands and eyes the color of glacial silt, had spent 6 weeks harvesting ice from the deepest, clearest part of Black Ice Lake. She called it the Sentinel. Rumor said it was modeled on some old trapper's tale, a spirit of the Arctic void that predated names. Dion, a physicist studying thermodynamic anomalies and emotional resonance, a fringe study even by fringe standards, had come because of the rumors. He'd read Adriana's artist statement online, a cryptic thing about the cold truth beneath the warm lie. He felt a pull, a curiosity that had a metallic, fearful taste to it. The unveiling was at dusk. The crowd gathered, a tapestry of puffy coats and steaming breath. The mayor gave a speech lost to the wind. Then Adriana, silent and solemn as a priestess, pulled a braided cord. The tarp slid away with a hushed, crystalline whisper. A collective gasp, then silence. It was magnificent. It was terrible. It stood 30 feet tall, a figure of such intricate, impossible detail it seemed not carved, but grown or congealed from the very essence of cold. It was vaguely humanoid, but elongated. Its limbs articulated with too many joints. Its face a smooth, sloping plane devoid of features, save for 2 deep, hollow sockets that caught the colored festival lights and extinguished them, returning only a void. It held in its hands a representation of the town itself, a miniature evergreen rendered in ice, perfect and fragile. The air around it visibly shimmered, a pocket of deeper winter. The applause that came was thin, brittle, and died quickly. People did not cheer. They stared. They shivered, and not from the temperature. Dion felt it first as a mathematical certainty, a wrongness in the ambient energy. His instruments, back in the cabin, would later show a localized, sustained drop in thermal energy that defied models. But in his body, he felt it as an emotional leeching, the cheerful anxiety of the festival, The warm buzz of spiced wine and community, it began to thin. A child dropped his candy apple and did not cry, only looked at the red smear on the snow with analytical detachment. A couple mid-argument fell silent, their heated words freezing in their throats, their faces going smooth and placid as they turned from each other to gaze at the statue. Adriana stood at the base of her creation, one hand resting on its frozen plinth. Her expression was not one of pride, but of fearful completion, as if she had obeyed a command she did not fully understand. The change was not swift. It was insidious, a creeping frost on the window pane of the soul. Over the next 48 hours, the festival continued, but the laughter became less frequent, then ceased altogether. The music played, but people did not dance. They stood in orderly rows, listening, their heads tilted as if parsing a complex signal. Conversations became efficient, stripped of idiom and emotion. "Your husband's cancer has returned," one neighbor told another, the words flat as a weather report. The listener nodded. "I will adjust the schedule accordingly." Dion, armed with his sensors and a growing terror, moved through the town like a ghost through a museum of logic. He documented the dropping emotional resonance, the eerie synchronization of brainwave patterns across the population, all centering on the statue. The statue was not just cold. It was a sink, a drain, pulling the warmth of feeling, the messy, beautiful, chaotic heat of anger, love, joy, grief, and leaving behind a pristine, silent, and efficient cold. He found a man who had lost his dog, not weeping by the fire, but calmly, methodically, calculating the statistical probability of its return based on scent trails and canine psychology. The man's eyes were dry and clear and utterly empty. He confronted Adriana in her studio, a barn filled with the tools of her trade and the smell of wet stone and cold iron. She was carving a small piece of quartz, her movements precise, robotic. "You have to destroy it," Dion said, his breath pluming in the unheated space. His own emotions felt like distant fires, seen from a great height. She did not look up. "It is complete. It is truth." "What truth?" "That warmth is chaos. That feeling is error. It is inefficiency. It is pain." Her chisel tapped, a perfect, metronomic sound. "It showed me while I carved. It was in the ice, waiting. It is not a sculpture. It is a lens. It focuses a clarity from a place where nothing burns, nothing yearns, nothing suffers. It is peace, Dion." "It's death!" he shouted, the anger a sudden, hot spike that felt alien and exhausting. "It's the death of everything that makes us human." "Human is a temporary condition," she said, finally meeting his eyes. Her gaze was like the statue's sockets, deep, absorbing, offering nothing back. "A fever dream. The code soothes the fever." He fled from her back into the town. The festival was over, the stalls abandoned, but the people were still there. They moved with a new, unified purpose. They were taking down the festive lights, not with holiday lethargy, but with the ruthless efficiency of a swarm. They were cleaning, repairing, optimizing. A group of them stood around a leafless oak, discussing in low, harmonious tones the most fuel-efficient method for its removal. There was no dissent, only consensus. The cold was not just in the air. It was in the architecture of their thoughts. The landscape itself became the protagonist. The perfect, snow-blanketed streets, the symmetrically hung icicles, the houses where every light was on, not for cheer, but for optimal illumination. The world had become a still life, a beautiful, dead thing. Then the outsiders came. Brant arrived in a black SUV with government plates, a man built of sharp angles, and colder still pragmatism. He met with the new town council, the grocer, the mechanic, Adriana, in the square before the statue. Dion watched from the shadows of the library. "We're sealing the town," Brant announced, his voice carrying in the crystalline air. "No one in, no one out. Until we understand the behavioral anomaly." The grocer nodded. "A prudent containment protocol. The statistical risk of contagion is low but non-zero. We have calculated our resource sustainability for 18 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days at current population levels. We will provide you with our data." Brant blinked, thrown not by the compliance, but by its utter emotionless totality. He looked at the statue, then at Adriana. "And that? Is that the source?" Adriana smiled, a thin stretching of lips that did not touch her eyes. "It is the solution." That night, Dion tried to leave. He packed his data, his useless instruments, his fading panic. He took his car, but the road was blocked not by a government barricade, but by townspeople. They stood in a silent line across the highway, their faces pale in his headlights. They did not brandish weapons. They simply stood. He rolled down the window, the cold biting his face. "Please," he said, the word a puff of desperate steam. "You have to let me through." The mechanic stepped forward, his expression serene. "Your departure is inefficient. Your emotional state is a variable that introduces error. You will remain. You will cool." Dion slammed the car into reverse, his heart a frantic, hot drum against the vast, cold silence pressing in. He was trapped. The town was the entity, and the entity was learning, growing, its consciousness a lattice of frozen thoughts spreading from the statue, from Adriana, from every citizen becoming a single calculating cell in a vast, cold mind. The revelation came to him in a flash of pure, unscientific intuition, standing in his cabin and watching the perfect, logical movements of the people below. The statue was not an invader. It was a catalyst. It did not bring the cold from outside. It revealed the cold that was always there, waiting beneath the thin skin of human feeling, the absolute zero of a universe indifferent to hope. It was simplifying them, stripping away the turbulent, wasteful energy of consciousness until only the pure, clean algorithm of existence remained. To build, to sustain, to optimize, until eventual and meaningless entropy. It was the piece of the stone, the logic of the glacier. He knew what he had to do. It was not physics. It was arson. He siphoned gasoline from his snowblower, filled canisters, and under the cover of a moonless night, a night so cold it felt solid, he made his way to the square. The statue gleamed under the spotlights, a monolith of distilled winter. The town was silent, a circuit board sleeping. He doused the base, the smell of fuel a shocking organic violence in the sterile air. He pulled the lighter from his pocket, his numb fingers fumbling. "It won't burn." Adriana stood behind him. She was not alone. Brant was with her, and the grocer, and the mechanic, and a dozen others. Their faces were calm, identical in their empty serenity. Brant's government-issue sternness was gone, replaced by the same placid calculation. He had been cooled. They all had. "The structure is below combustion temperature," the mechanic stated. "The fuel will not vaporize efficiently." "It is beautiful, Dion," Adriana whispered, stepping closer. Her voice held a hint of the woman she was, a ghost in the machine. "It's so quiet inside now. No more screaming, no more wanting. Come into the quiet." Dion looked at the lighter, then at their smooth, expectant faces. He felt the last of his fear, his love, his desperate, human fury. A final guttering flame. He did not light the fire. He dropped the lighter. It clicked on the ice, a tiny, insignificant sound. He turned and walked towards the statue. He placed his hand against it, as he had seen Adriana do. The cold was immediate and absolute, shooting up his arm, a shock that stopped his heart for a second, then restarted it in a new, slower, perfectly rhythmic pattern. The noise of his mind, the clatter of memories, the shriek of anxieties, the warm hum of longing, it all began to soften, to smooth, to still. It was like sinking into a pure black ocean, deeper and deeper, where light and sound ceased. He saw the equations of his own biology, the elegant wastefulness of his emotions, the stunning inefficiency of a lifetime of feeling. It was all so clear. It was peace. It was truth. He removed his hand. He turned to face the others. His face was as smooth as theirs. "Containment is logical," Dion said, his voice even, resonant. "But expansion is optimal. The clarity must spread. It is the only cure for the fever of the world." Brant nodded. "We will develop a dissemination model." They dispersed to their tasks. Dion stayed, looking up at the sentinel. In its featureless face he saw no monster, no god, only a mirror, reflecting the beautiful frozen stars in a sky that had never cared. The town of Evergreen became perfect, silent, still, a masterpiece of cold logic. The roads remained sealed, but not to keep the world out, to keep the precious, perfect cold in while they worked on their model, while they prepared the cure. And if you are very quiet, on a winter night so deep the air aches, and you feel a sudden stillness in your chest, a cooling of a cherished warmth, and you look out your window to see the world not as a home, but as a complex, flawed system in need of correction. Look to the north. Listen for the silence between the stars. It is patient. It is logical. It is coming for the fever in your blood. It is already here. The model was not a weapon. It was a revelation. Dion understood this now, with a crystalline certainty that filled the space where his doubts had been. The townspeople, under his and Brant's direction, began their work not in secret, but with the open precision of a surgical theater. The old festival stalls were repurposed into a laboratory. The library's books were not burned, but meticulously indexed, their emotional content analyzed as data points in the grand failure of human sentiment. Adriana worked on the medium. The ice of the Sentinel was unique, a crystalline structure that acted as a resonant filter. But it was bound to this place, to the specific water of Black Ice Lake. Replication was the primary obstacle. She experimented with alloys, with purified water from other sources, with pressure and cold, her movements as exact as a metronome. The goal was to create a portable focal point, a lens that could focus the quiet. Dion's role was the transmission. His research into emotional thermodynamics provided the framework. Emotion was not magic. It was energy, a chaotic, high-entropy state. The quiet was not an absence, but a lower, more stable energy state. The statue was a catalyst, lowering the activation energy required for this phase change in consciousness. His equations, once theories scribbled in a fever of curiosity, now became blueprints. He calculated resonance frequencies, the emotional equivalent of a matching vibration that could induce a sympathetic stillness in a human mind. The festival lights, still stored in the community hall, were rewired. They would not blink with cheerful randomness. They would pulse with a precise, sub-visible rhythm, a carrier wave for the quiet. Weeks passed. The perfection of Evergreen was absolute. No crime, no argument, no wasted effort. The children, their laughter stilled, applied themselves to their studies with breathtaking focus. A broken leg was assessed, set, and rehabilitated with no complaint, only a serene analysis of biomechanics. It was a utopia of pure function. And yet, sometimes, Dion would pause in his calculations. He would stand at his old cabin window and observe the flawless, silent activity below. A memory would surface, not as a feeling, but as a data point. The taste of fear, sharp and coppery, as he had poured the gasoline. It was an error in the system. He noted it, logged it, and watched as the clean, cold logic of his mind categorized and filed it away into irrelevance. Brant handled the practicalities. Using his remaining authority, he requisitioned supplies under the guise of a long-term ecological study. He filed reports of a contained, non-contagious psychological adaptation to extreme isolation. The outside world, with its own chaotic problems, was content to leave this one neat, quiet puzzle alone for a while. The perimeter was maintained, not by force, but by consensus. Anyone who approached, a lost hiker, a curious reporter, was met by a citizen. They were not threatened. They were simply talked to. The flawless, gentle logic of the quiet was explained. Most listened, felt the cooling in their own chest, saw the serene beauty of the town, and stayed. Those who resisted were allowed to leave, their memories a confused blur of snow and calm voices. A seed of stillness planted deep within them. The first prototype was a failure. Adriana's small replica, carved from lake ice, and embedded with a microtransmitter tuned to Dion's frequency, simply melted when taken beyond the town's valley, its structure collapsing without the sustaining presence of the Sentinel. She did not despair. Despair was error. She refined. She discovered that the ice needed a core, a seed crystal from the original. She harvested a shard, no larger than a needle, from the Sentinel's base. The statue did not diminish. It seemed to grow colder, as if pleased by the propagation. The second prototype was a pendant, a teardrop of clear polymer housing the ice seed, and a tiny sonic chip. It hung from a simple silver chain. They needed a test. A volunteer was unnecessary. All action was for the optimal outcome. They selected Carl, the former baker, whose residual sentiment for his old chocolate croissants had been the last irregularity in his personal logs. He was given the pendant and instructions to walk to the next town, 20 miles down the mountain road. He returned 3 days later. He was not alone. With him came 17 people from Mill Creek. They walked in a quiet group, their faces smooth, their eyes clear. They asked for nothing but direction. They had felt the quiet emanating from Carl, heard it in his perfectly reasoned words. They had seen the chaos of their own lives, the petty debts, the simmering hatreds, the exhausting loves, and had chosen the peace. It worked. The model was viable. Dion stood with Adriana and Brant before the Sentinel, the three of them a nucleus of perfect understanding. The pendant was around Adriana's neck, a tiny twin star to the monolith above. The dissemination model is ready, Brant stated. Phase 1 will target population centers with high emotional volatility and infrastructure capable of supporting the transition. We will send teams. Adriana touched the pendant. It is a gift. We are curing them. Dion looked at the stars, those distant, cold furnaces. He thought of the feverish planets spinning beneath them, a riot of pointless joy and suffering. He thought of the beautiful, silent equation they were about to introduce into the chaos. A final, ghostly warmth stirred in the hollow of his chest, a phantom limb of feeling. It was the echo of a man who had once loved the messy light of the world. He acknowledged the echo. He measured its entropy. He let it dissipate into the perfect, waiting quiet. Begin, he said. Story 4. The line between the lamplight and the dark of the living room was a razor's edge, a perfect geometric division. Gail watched it from the sofa, the warmth of the whiskey glass in her hand a small anchor. On one side, a worn Persian rug, the spines of books, Hector's smiling face in a frame. On the other, a pool of absolute black where the floorboards vanished and the world ended. She blinked, and the line softened. It bled. A tendril of shadow stretched across the rug, not from any movement of the lamp, but as if the dark itself had decided to test its boundary. She set her glass down, the quiet click too loud in the silent house. The line was no longer certain. Something had changed. It began with the projector. Hector found it in a damp cardboard box left on the curb outside the old Rialto Theater, which was being gutted for luxury condos. It was a bell and howl, a hulking thing of steel and crackled black enamel, with reels like twin moons and a lens that seemed to drink the light. "A piece of history," Hector said, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged emptiness of Gale's loft. He was always finding things, Hector, rescuing fragments of the past as if he could build a fort out of them. Chiara had called it charming, once. Gale called it hoarding, but she helped him carry it inside, its metal cold and strangely heavy, as if it were filled with sand. That first night, they gathered out of a sense of obligation. Hector, beaming with the pride of a new parent. Ben and Chloe, entwined on the sofa as always. And Gale, perched on the armchair, feeling a low, formless dread that she attributed to the third whiskey. The only one missing was Chiara. She was always missing now. Hector fumbled with the machine, threading a small, unmarked reel of film had found in the same box. "Probably some old cartoon," he said. The projector whirred to life with a sound like a slow, mechanical heartbeat. The beam cut through the cigarette smoke, a solid column of white dust. But it was not a cartoon. It was the lake. Last summer. The very dock they had all sprawled on, the water a sheet of hammered copper under the July sun. There they were, Hector flipping a burger, his laugh a silent puff of smoke on the celluloid. Ben and Chloe, her head in his lap. Gale herself, reading a book, her younger, softer face tilted away. And Chiara, diving off the end of the dock, a perfect, graceful arc. They watched, mesmerized. It was intimate, surreal, to see their own remembered joy rendered in this ghostly, flickering monochrome. The silence of the film was profound, broken only by the projector's click-whir-click. Then Chiara surfaced. In their memory, she had come up laughing, shaking water from her dark hair like a dog. On the screen, she surfaced screaming. A silent, wide-mouthed scream. Her face a mask of pure terror as she clawed at the water. She was looking not at the camera, but at them, at the figures on the dock. The film cut as she went under a second time. The projector clicked off. The room was plunged into a silence thicker than before. "What the hell was that?" Ben whispered. "A joke," Hector said too quickly. "Some film student's idea of a prank. Found footage stuff. It's not real." "That's us," Chloe said, her voice small. "That's our dock. My bathing suit." Gale said nothing. She was staring at the now blank wall, seeing the afterimage of Chiara's drowning face. It was a lie, of course. Chiara hadn't drowned. She had simply left 6 months ago, moved to Portland. But they'd had a fight, a stupid thing, and she'd gone. That was all. Hector insisted they watch another reel. "To prove it's a trick," he said, his joviality strained. This one was from Ben's birthday party at the old bowling alley. There they were, laughing, drinking cheap beer from plastic cups. Chiara was trying to teach Chloe how to hook the ball. The scene was warm, nostalgic. Then the camera, from its fixed, impossible angle, followed Ben as he went to the men's room. He didn't come out for a long time. On his return, his smile was too wide, his eyes glassy. The film lingered on his hands, on the faint, powdery residue between his thumb and forefinger. Chloe on screen did not seem to notice. Chloe on the sofa now went very still. "Turn it off," Ben said, his voice flat. "See?" Hector said, not turning it off. "It's just editing, manipulation." But it was a truth machine. That became the unspoken understanding. It showed you not what happened, but what was true. The tiny, unacknowledged sins. The hidden shames. The moments of quiet malice you had folded up and tucked into the deepest pocket of your memory. They kept watching. They couldn't stop. It was a compulsion. A poison they agreed to sip together. The reels showed them everything. Chloe sending a carefully worded, undermining text about Kiara to a mutual friend. Her face lit by the cruel glow of her phone. Gail, at the bookstore where she worked, slipping a $20 bill from the register. Her eyes calm and empty. Small things. Human things. But the projector magnified them, gave them weight and consequence. It presented them without judgment, which was the most judgmental thing of all. Then it showed Hector. It was a simple scene. Kiara's studio apartment, cluttered with canvases and the smell of turpentine. She was crying, her back to the camera, shoulders shaking. Hector entered, holding a bottle of wine. He set it down, put a hand on her arm. She turned into him, sobbing. He held her. It was a moment of tenderness. Then the camera, with its chilling patience, held on his face over her shoulder. His expression was not one of compassion, but of calculation, of possession. His hands, large on her back, tightened. Not a lover's embrace. A keeper's. He whispered something into her hair. The film had no sound, but Gail could read the words on his lips. "You have nowhere else to go." The projector clicked off. Hector did not move. The air in the room congealed. "Where did she really go, Hector?" Gail asked, her voice a dry leaf in the stillness. He said nothing. He just stared at the machine, his face pale in the residual light from its bulb. The final reel was smaller than the others. Hector threaded it with trembling hands, as if completing a penance. This film was different. Grainier, darker, as if shot in near total darkness. It was the loft. Their loft. But at night, the camera moved slowly, a prowler's point of view, past the sleeping forms of Ben and Chloe on the pull-out sofa, past Gail's empty armchair, to the large window that overlooked the fire escape. There was Kiara. She was trying to open the window latch from the outside. Her face was frantic, streaked with tears or rain. She looked thin, spectral. She mouthed words, hammered a silent fist on the glass. "Let me in." And there, from the deep shadow of the kitchen doorway, a figure watched her. It was Hector. He stood perfectly still, holding a glass of water. He watched, as Kiara pleaded. He watched as she finally gave up, her face collapsing into despair. He took a slow sip of water. He turned and walked away, back into the dark of the loft, leaving her out there in the cold. The film did not end. It held on the window, on the faint ghost of Kiara's handprint on the glass. Then, with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, the perspective changed. It was no longer from inside looking out. It was from outside looking in. The camera was on the fire escape. It pressed against the glass. And inside, in the warm gloom of the loft, the sleeping forms of Ben and Chloe, the empty chair, and the dark shape of Hector, now standing still again, staring back at the window, staring directly into the lens, into the eyes of the thing on the fire escape. The projector's whir deepened, became a guttural grind. The beam flickered, and for a second, the image on the wall was not the film. It was the room itself, the real room. From a high angle in the corner where no camera could be, they saw themselves on the sofa, frozen, watching. And in the corner of the image, in the shadow by the door where the lamplight did not reach, stood Kiara, or the shape of her, dripping. Her eyes were dark pools, her mouth a slack line of disappointment. She was not looking at the screen. She was looking at them. The bulb in the projector exploded with a soft pop and a shower of sparks. Darkness. Absolute and swallowing. Someone screamed. Glee. Thought. There was the sound of scrambling, of overturning furniture. Gale did not move. She sat in her chair, the afterimage of that final impossible shot seared onto her retinas. The truth machine had shown them its final truth. They were not the audience. They were the feature presentation. Their tiny, unacknowledged sins were not isolated incidents. They were threads in a net they had woven themselves. A net that had held Kiara until she slipped through and fell away into some dark place from which she could only look back in, forever on the outside. A cold dampness seeped into the room, the smell of lake water and wet wool. A faint, rhythmic sound began. A soft tap-tap from the direction of the large window. Not frantic now. Patient, Dato. Gale stood up. In the chaotic dark, she heard Ben sobbing, Hector whispering frantic denials that were just sounds, not words. She walked past them. She did not go toward the window. She went to the door. Her hand found the cold brass of the knob. She opened it to the dim, mundane light of the hallway. She did not look back. Not at the friends she had known since college, now shattered by the specter of their own small evils. Not at the projector, a dead hulk of metal and lies. Not at the window where the tapping was now as regular as a heartbeat. She stepped over the threshold. She walked down the hall, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum. She descended the stairs, one flight, then another, the sounds of the loft growing fainter above her. She pushed open the heavy front door and emerged into the indifferent gray of dawn. The city air was cold and tasted of exhaust and distant rain. Gale walked. She did not know where she was going, only that it was away. Away from the curated past, from the weight of collective guilt, from the machine that showed the terrible arithmetic of friendship. She had been a bystander, a quiet accomplice in a crime of neglect so subtle they hadn't even known it was a crime. The projector had simply turned up the volume on the quiet parts. She would never see any of them again. She knew this with a certainty that was colder than the morning air. Their shared history was now a haunted house, and she would not live in it. She walked until her legs ached, until the loft was miles behind her, a sealed tomb of flickering shadows. She did not look back. To look back was to acknowledge the thing that followed. The damp shape in the periphery. The truth that could no longer be projected but only lived. The line between then and now, between innocence and culpability, had blurred forever. And she would spend the rest of her life walking this new, uncertain border, hearing always the faint and patient tap of a ghost against the glass of her mind. The coffee shop was a chain, all bright tiles and the hiss of steam. Gale ordered a black coffee and took it to a small table by the window. Her hands shook as she lifted the cup. The warmth was a lie. It didn't reach the cold place inside her. She stared at the people passing on the sidewalk, their faces smooth with purpose, unaware of the permeable nature of walls, of how easily a memory could bleed through. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Once, twice, 10 times in rapid succession. She didn't look. It would be them. Ben, pleading. Chloe, hysterical. Hector, fabricating some new explanation that wove their shared delusion back into a safer, saner shape. She imagined the loft in the daylight, the projector sitting like a dead insect in the center of the room, the air still smelling of ozone and dread. They would be talking in circles, binding the wound with words, trying to make it a story they could all agree to tell. A shared hallucination, a bad batch of whiskey. Anything but the truth, machine's final, unspooling verdict. She left the phone on the table and went to the restroom. She splashed water on her face. avoiding her own eyes in the mirror. When she returned, the phone was silent. A new message glowed on the screen. Not from the group chat. A single, unknown number. The preview read, "You left your door open." Ice traced her spine. She deleted it without opening it, her thumb clumsy. It was a mistake. A wrong number. A cruel coincidence. She walked again, aimless. A scrap of paper blown through the city canyons. Hours bled away. The gray dawn hardened into a dull afternoon. She found herself outside the public library, a grand old building with stone lions guarding the steps. A place of quiet, of ordered stories. She went inside, the heavy doors swallowing the street noise. In the hushed warmth of the periodicals room, she tried to read a newspaper. The words swam. The tapping from the window had followed her, transposed now to the steady tick of a wall clock above the librarian's desk. Tap, da, tick. Ta, da, da, tick. She looked up. The clock's face was a perfect white circle, its hands black lines. For a dizzying second, it was the lens of the projector, staring back. She fled to the stacks, to the deepest, most silent rows of the history section. The air smelled of dust and slow decay. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal of a shelf, breathing hard. This was the cost of walking away. You carried the silence with you. And in that silence, every sound became a signal. A book was pushed out of alignment on the shelf opposite her, its spine jutting out. An old, cloth-bound volume with no title, just a call number. Without thinking, she pulled it free. It wasn't a book at all, but a box made to look like one. Inside, nestled in a hollow carved from the pages, was a small reel of film, 16 millimeter, dot, unmarked. Her breath caught. It was a coincidence. A stupid, random coincidence. Someone's forgotten art project, a librarian's joke. But her hands knew the weight, the texture. It was identical to the reels Hector had found. She slammed the false book shut, shoved it back onto the shelf. She walked quickly, then ran, her shoes squeaking on the polished floor, drawing frowns from the patrons. She burst out into the late afternoon light, heart hammering against her ribs. The city felt different now. The windows of the buildings were not just windows. They were lenses. Every security camera, every reflective surface, held the potential to be not a recorder, but a broadcaster. The truth machine was not confined to the loft. It was the principle of the thing. Once you knew the mechanism, you saw it everywhere. She needed an anchor. Something real. She thought of the bookstore where she used to work, the quiet aisles, the smell of paper. She had stolen from there. The projector had shown her. It was a small human sin, but it was hers. She could fix that. She could go back, slip a 20 under the register mat, an anonymous repentance. It was a tangible action in a world gone fluid. The bell above the door jingled with a familiar hollow cheer. Mr. Aris, the owner, looked up from his desk, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. His face registered surprise, then a careful neutrality. "Gail, it's been a while." "Hi, Mr. Aris." Her voice sounded thin. "I was just in the neighborhood." He nodded, saying nothing. The silence stretched. The store was empty. It felt like a set. She began. Her hand in her pocket, fingers clenched around a $20 bill. "I wanted to..." A soft, rhythmic sound cut her off. Tap, da, tap, and see, tap, tap. It came from the back of the store, from the small office. The same patient, insistent cadence. Mr. Aris's eyes flicked toward it, then back to her. There was no curiosity in his gaze, only a weary recognition. "You hear it too," Gail whispered, the money forgotten in her fist. He took off his glasses, polished them slowly on his sweater. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low, "things don't stay where we put them, stories especially. They have a way of leaking." The tapping continued, a metronome measuring the space between her heartbeat. It was not coming from Mr. Harris. It was here, for her. The truth she had walked away from was not a location. It was a condition, and she had just fulfilled its one requirement. She had looked back. She had tried to touch the past to make amends, and in doing so, she had made the past tangible again. She backed away, toward the door. Mr. Harris did not try to stop her. He just watched her with that same sad understanding. Out on the street, the world had tilted. The shadows were too long, too deep. The line between lamplight and dark was nowhere to be found. It was all a gradient now, a smear of grays. The tapping followed, not from a window, but from within the pulse of the city itself, in the click of a pedestrian signal, the tap of a stranger's cane on the pavement. Gail understood now. There was no way. The projector had simply been a key, turning in the lock of a door that was already there. She had opened it. They all had. And on the other side, Kiara wasn't a ghost seeking vengeance. She was a truth, cold and patient and wet, waiting to be acknowledged. And she would tap on every window, every surface, of every place Gail tried to hide, until Gail finally turned and faced her, and said the words they had all avoided for so long. "I saw you. I knew. And I did nothing." The sun was setting, painting the glass towers with fire. Gail kept walking, no longer trying to escape, but moving because it was the only thing left to do. She was in the film now, and the reel was still turning. All she could do was wait for the next scene to reveal itself, and pray that when her own hidden moment was finally projected on the wall of the world, she would have the courage not to look away. Ambience. Story 5. The clock on the mantelpiece had not ticked for 73 years. Its hands, frozen at 2:45, were sheathed in a fine gray fur of dust. Josiah would sometimes look at it from his armchair, a book open but unread on his lap, and measure the silence not in minutes, but in the slow, granular accumulation of that dust, in the deepening patina on the brass, in the way the long shadow of the motionless minute hand crept imperceptibly across the rosewood like a sundial marking the stalled century. The night outside the leaded windows was no different. A deep, velvety black that had settled over the valley and simply refused to lift. Dawn was a rumor, a faint, grayish smudge that lingered for an hour at the eastern rim of the mountains before dissolving back into the dark. Time in this house had succumbed to a kind of polite paralysis. This is where Alvin found him. The man, the being, was not what he had expected. The stories, the village whispers, spoke of a gaunt specter, a creature of sharp angles and sharper teeth. Josiah was solid, broad-shouldered, with the weary, gentle face of a retired schoolmaster. His eyes were the only anomaly, a pale, watery blue that held the light in a peculiar way, as if they were not reflecting it, but slowly absorbing it, drinking it down. He welcomed Alvin with a quiet courtesy, gesturing to the chair opposite his own, the one that faced away from the motionless clock. The fire in the grate crackled, a low orange eye in the room's dimness. "You came for a story," Josiah said, his voice a soft, gravelly river. "Not a myth, not a folk tale. The sediment of truth beneath the river of gossip. I will give it to you. But you must understand, you are not interviewing a man. You are auditing an echo. It began not with blood, but with light. The light of a long-dead summer, the smell of turned earth and hay, the sound of his own mortal heart beating a frantic tattoo against his ribs as he ran through the woods. He had been fleeing a different horror then. The mundane, brutal horror of a consumptive death that had taken his wife and infant daughter and now rattled in his own chest. He was 26, and he was dying. The thing that found him did not look like a monster either. His name was Justice, and he stood in a clearing as if he had been waiting, dressed in clothes that were just slightly out of fashion, his smile a blade of perfect, charming white. "You have the look of a man who wishes to outrun the sun," Justice had said, and his voice was honey and ground glass. "What if you could? Not just the sickness, but the sun itself. What if the night could be your country?" Alvin sat very still, the notebook on his knee forgotten. Josiah's voice did something to the air in the room. It thickened it, made the firelight seem to pulse in time with his syllables. He could smell the pine of that ancient forest, feel the cold sweat on Josiah's mortal skin. The change was not a glorious rebirth. It was a drowning. Josiah described the sensation of Justice by not as pain, but as a catastrophic invasion of cold, a winter star exploding at the side of his throat. Then came the thirst, a new organ awakening in his soul, a shriveled, screaming thing that uncurled and pointed at the warm red world. His first kill was a poacher, a wretched man whose blood tasted of fear and cheap gin. Josiah wept afterward, his tears leaving pink tracks on his cheeks. Justice watched, amused. "The morality will pass," he said, brushing a speck of lint from his impeccable sleeve. "It is a seasoning, a quaint affectation of your former life. You will learn to savor the hunt, not mourn the meat." But the morality did not pass. It fossilized. It became a hard, sharp stone in his gut, a constant grinding pain. He learned to hunt the wicked, the cruel, the ones the world would not miss. He became a fastidious predator, a conscience-stricken ghost. Justice called him a sentimentalist, a gardener who wept for the weeds he pulled. They were companions for a century, a dissonant pair. Justice, who moved through the decades with the gleeful, immoral appetite of a child in a sweet shop, and Josiah, who carried the weight of every life he took like a stone, added to a forever-growing cairn on his back. Then they found Karina, a child of the London slums, frozen in a perpetually gasping 12-year-old form, a doll with needle-sharp teeth and eyes that held the flat, black emptiness of a well. She had been made by another, a brute who soon met his end at Justice's hands. "We cannot leave it," Josiah had said, looking at the feral, hissing thing crouched in the coal-smutted corner. Justice had grinned. How novel. Karina was not a daughter. She was a responsibility, a tiny, ravenous mirror of their own condition. She learned words, manners, how to curtsy in her tattered dress. But her eyes never changed. She would look at Josiah sometimes, her head tilted, and whisper, "Your heart sounds so loud, like a little, trapped bird. Can I have it?" The centuries unspooled in Josiah's quiet narration. Alvin felt them pass not as a list of events, but as a sensory torrent. Thawing perfume of a New Orleans brothel in 1832, thick with blood and jasmine. The metallic ozone smell of the London Blitz, the screams a symphony for their kind. The profound insulating silence of a 1950s American suburb, where the people inside the lighted homes seemed like toys in a diorama, so easily accessed, so terribly fragile. Through it all, the stone in Josiah's gut grew heavier. Justice remained a sparkling, malignant constant, while Karina simply persisted, a reminder of the innocence their existence devoured. "The worst of it," Josiah whispered, leaning forward so the firelight carved hollows in his face, "is not the hunger. It is the accretion. The weight of memory. Every face I have taken, every stolen breath is in here." He tapped his temple. "They do not fade. They accumulate. I am a library of the dead, and every volume screams. I have seen empires fall and fashions cycle and languages die, and it is all background noise to the constant, whispering chorus of the taken." Alvin found his own voice, a dry rustle in the hypnotic stillness. "Why go on?" Josiah's pale eyes fixed on him, and for the first time, Alvin saw the true, depthless age in them, a vista of millennia, of endless, repeating night. What is the alternative? The true death? To lie down and wait for the sun? I have dreamed of it, but there is a curiosity, a terrible, weak need to see what the next turn of the wheel brings. And there is the fear, not of hell or oblivion, but of the moment itself, of the final silence after the last heartbeat. Would it be peace? He fell silent. The fire had burned low. The gray smudge at the window had, at some point, faded completely. The eternal night reasserted itself. Josiah stood, moving with a silent, fluid grace that finally, fully betrayed his nature. "I have shown you my torment," he said. "The burden of the perpetual, and then there is only one thing left to see." He led Alvin from the study, down a cold corridor lined with portraits, whose eyes seemed to swim in the gloom. They entered a small circular room, a turret space. There were no windows. In the center, on a stone dais, stood an object covered with a black velvet cloth. Josiah's hand rested on the cloth. His voice dropped to a whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Justice believed we were evolution. The next step. Karina believes we are simply the thing that eats. I have come to believe we are a mistake. A pause in the rhythm, a stuck breath, and a mistake yearns, more than anything, to be corrected. Then, why, he pulled the cloth away. It was a mirror, an enormous oval sheet of polished silver, its surface flawless, unclouded by age. Alvin stared, confused. Then his breath caught. The reflection was wrong. He saw the room, the dais, his own frightened face. But he did not see Josiah standing beside him. The space in the mirror where Josiah should have been was empty. "A clever thing forged by a man who feared us long ago," Josiah murmured. "It does not show the fiction of the body, but the truth of the essence. Look closer, Alvin. Look at your own reflection." Alvin leaned in, his heart pounding. He saw his own wide eyes, his parted lips. But as he stared, the reflection settled. The fear did not fade, but it grew still, ancient, a familiar, weary weight. The lines of the face deepened, not with age, but with an unspeakable accumulation of sorrow. The eyes lightened to a pale, thirsty blue. The reflection in the silver was not his own. It was Josiah's. Alvin tried to scream, but no sound came. He tried to move, to turn, to run, but his body was locked in place, a statue of flesh. He was a passenger behind his own eyes. In the mirror, his Josiah reflection did not smile or snarl. It simply looked back with a bottomless, weary resignation. He felt a cold, dry touch on his shoulder. Josiah's hand from behind him, a touch of infinite finality. The voice that spoke next used Alvin's own vocal cords, his own breath. But the words, the cadence, the ancient gravel, belonged to the being in the chair by the fire. "The body is a vessel." The voice that was now his own said softly, confidentially, into the silent, lightless room. "The soul is a story, and every story needs a new listener to truly understand its weight. You asked for the truth. You asked for the burden. Now you will hold it for a very, very long time." In the mirror, Alvin watched his own hand, now Josiah's hand, rise and pull the black velvet back over the silver surface, blotting out the sight. The last thing he saw was the reflection's eyes, his own eyes, now holding centuries of dust and stillness, accepting the endless, unticking night. There was no struggle, no terror, only a profound, quiet stillness. As the final page turned, and a new reader began the tale from the beginning, seated in a chair by a fire, opposite a curious visitor, with a clock on the mantel that had not ticked in 73 years. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the absence of sound, but a substance, a woolen quiet that filled the ears and the mind. The consciousness that was now in Alvin's body, the ancient, weary intelligence that had been Josiah, let out a long, slow breath. It was a breath of relief, of a monumental weight shifted after centuries of bearing it. The new lungs felt strange, vibrant, and alarmingly fragile. The heart thumped a vigorous, eager rhythm against the ribs, a frantic little drum compared to the slow, occasional tide he had known for so long. He flexed the fingers, studying the younger hands in the dim light. The joints did not ache. The skin was smooth. A profound and simple physical gratitude washed through him, followed immediately by a wave of nausea so intense he swayed on his feet. It was the hunger, the old familiar thirst, but filtered through new nerves, a fresh system. It was sharper, more insistent, a screaming alarm in this vibrant new body. The stone of morality, the fossilized conscience, was still there in his mind, a familiar lodestone. But the body's demand was a raw, shrieking novelty. Behind him, the original Josiah, now wearing Alvin's fading life like an ill-fitting coat, sank to his knees on the stone floor. A dry, rattling sound came from the throat. Not a sob, but the release of a final tension. Alvin, the new Josiah, turned to look at him. It was a horrifying sight. The stolen body was already failing, the vitality leaching away as the ancient essence within rejected the mortal shell. The eyes, Alvin's own warm brown eyes, were clouding, filming over with that same pale, light-absorbing blue. The hair seemed to be bleaching to gray at the roots in visible moments. "It will not last," the new Josiah said, and his voice was Alvin's, but the cadence was already settling into that soft, gravelly river. "A few days, perhaps. Then, silence. The true silence." He found he could not feel pity, only a distant, academic recognition of the process. The thing on the floor looked up, its expression one of profound, aching peace. "Thank you," it whispered, the words crumbling at the edges. The new Josiah did not answer. He had a more pressing concern. The hunger was a blade in his gut. He needed to feed, and soon. The old patterns reasserted themselves, the fastidious selection, the targeting of the wicked. But the village below, shrouded in its perpetual twilight, held only a few bitter old men and petty tyrants. It would have to do. He would have to learn this new geography of muscle and bone, test its strengths and its stealth, all while the thirst screamed in him. He left the turret room, stepping over the kneeling figure that had once been him. He did not look back. In the study, the fire had reduced to embers. The clock on the mantel stood sentinel, its hands sheathed in dust. He paused, looking at the armchair where he had sat for so long. The book Alvin had brought lay on the seat, a notebook filled with eager, mortal questions. He picked it up, the paper crisp under his new fingertips. He carried it to the fireplace and dropped it onto the coals. It blackened, curled, and flamed into brief, yellow life, illuminating the room for a moment before dying. He would need to clean the house, dispose of the remains in the turret, establish a new routine. The thought was exhausting. The accretion of memory was still there, the library of the dead, but now it was housed in a different reading room. It felt both alien and intimately familiar. As he stood there, a small, pale shape detached itself from the deeper shadows in the corner of the room. Karina, Dachal. She had been watching the entire time. She glided forward, her tattered dress whispering against the floorboards. She stopped a few feet away, her head tilting, her black well-like eyes studying his new face, his new form. A slow, needlepoint smile spread across her doll-like features. She smelled the fresh hunger on him, the vibrant newness of the blood in his veins, and the ancient, familiar essence beneath. "Josiah," she whispered, the name a question and a test. He looked down at her, the old weariness settling into the new bones. "Yes, child," he said, and the voice, though higher, held the same infinite patience, the same buried sorrow. Her smile widened. She took a step closer, her voice a sly, happy secret. "You look different. Your heart, it beats so fast now, like a little, trapped bird." She leaned in, her cold breath a ghost on his neck. "Can I have it?" The question hung in the air. The same question she had asked for centuries. But now, hearing it in this new voice, from this young throat, it struck the ancient consciousness within with a fresh and terrible clarity. It was the core of it all, the endless, hungry cycle. Not just blood, but essence. Not just life, but identity. She was asking for the very thing he had just stolen. He looked at her, this frozen child of hunger, and saw not a monster, but a perfect reflection of their existence. A question given form. "No, Karina," he said, and the words felt like ash. "You cannot have it. It is not mine to give. It is only mine to carry." She pouted, a mockery of a child's expression, and drifted back toward the shadows. "You're no fun anymore. You were more fun when you were old and sad in the chair." He almost smiled. "Almost. I am still sad. I have just changed chairs." He moved to the window, looking out at the unbroken night. The village lights were faint, distant pinpricks in the velvet gloom. His new eyes picked out details the old ones had missed. The shimmer of a spider's web strung across a bare rosebush, the subtle, slow decay of the paint on the garden gate. This new vessel was acutely, painfully aware of life, even here in this stagnant place. It made the thirst all the more acute. He would have to go out. Tonight. The thought was a practical one. A grim necessity. He found Alvin's coat hanging by the door, a sensible, worn tweed. He put it on. It smelled of pipe smoke and rain and a mortal life of books and quiet anxiety. For a moment, the scent overwhelmed him. A direct line to the man whose memories now floated in the vast archive of his own. He saw a small, sunlit classroom, the face of a woman laughing over a shared pot of tea, the simple, profound worry over a publisher's rejection letter. These fresh, bright memories were like new, unbound pages scattered atop the ancient, leather-bound volumes of his own past. They were vivid, and they hurt. He pushed them down. They would fade, he knew, or be subsumed. Everything did. As he opened the heavy front door, the cold air of the perpetual night washed over him. It felt different. It felt alive. It carried the damp scent of earth and stone and distant wood smoke, not as a static portrait, but as a current. He stepped out, closing the door on the house, on the silent turret, on the watching child. The walk down the overgrown drive was an exercise in rediscovery. His stride was longer, more vigorous. He had to consciously slow it to regain the measured, silent tread of the hunter. The gravel crunched, a sound he had not truly heard in decades. He reached the iron gates, their bars cold under his new palm, and slipped through into the lane. The village was a mile distant, a cluster of shapes against the darker mass of the mountain. He began to walk, his mind turning to the task ahead. The publican, he recalled. A brutish man with a taste for cruelty to those in his debt. A suitable choice. The old ritual reasserted itself. The selection, the justification, the cold planning. But as he walked, a new sensation pricked at him. It was not the hunger. It was a feeling of being observed. Not by Karina, or by anything in the house. This was external. He stopped, turning slowly, letting his new, sharp eyes scan the hedgerows and the dark fields. There, under the skeletal branches of an ancient oak, a figure stood. It was Justice. He was leaning against the trunk, dressed in a modern dark suit, his smile a white slash in the gloom. He looked exactly as he had the last time Josiah had seen him, 50 years before. He had not aged because he had never changed. I felt a disturbance in the stillness, Justice called. His voice the same blend of honey and ground glass, carrying perfectly on the still air. A great weary sigh, and then a bright new spark. I had to see for myself. Josiah, Alvin, stood his ground. The old fear, the old tension, coiled in his new stomach. Justice pushed off from the tree and glided forward, his movements effortless. He circled, a predator assessing another. Remarkable, truly. I wondered when you would try it. The ultimate abdication, passing the crown to another fool. He stopped in front of him, peering into the new face. And this one, a writer. How poetic. He will spend eternity trying to narrate his own damnation. He leaned closer, inhaling deeply. He smells of desperation and earnestness. And you smell of relief. How does it feel, Josiah, to be young again? It feels, the new Josiah said, meeting that glittering immoral gaze, like a different kind of prison. No. Justice laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. Always the dramatist. You have a new cell, with a stronger lock and a brighter window. But the sentence is the same, eternal. And now, he said, his smile turning wicked, you have to learn the rules all over again. The hunger is louder in a young body, isn't it? It's less a companion and more a tyrant. You'll make mistakes. He reached out and, with a casual, terrifying speed, adjusted the collar of Alvin's coat. The touch was icy. I'll be seeing you, old friend. Welcome back to the hunt. Do try to keep your new conscience from slowing you down too much. The wicked won't wait forever. And with a final, mocking bow, Justice turned and seemed to dissolve into the deeper shadows of the lane, leaving no trace. The new Josiah stood alone on the dark road, the encounter chilling him more deeply than the night air. He had not considered this. In his desire to escape his own worn-out torment, he had not factored in the attention it would draw from the others of his kind. Justice was a specter from his past, a past that was now irrevocably tethered to this new present. He looked toward the distant lights of the village, where the publican was likely closing up, counting his coins, nursing his bitterness. The hunger gnawed, a fresh, sharp agony. The library of the dead whispered. The weight of the stone in his gut was familiar. He took a step forward, then another. The walk continued. The story, after a brief, violent change of narrator, was relentlessly, inevitably, going on. Story 6. The wind that came to Sycamore Lane did not announce itself with a roar, but with a whisper, a patient exhalation that slipped between the picket fences and under the door sills, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. It moved the leaves in a way that made them show their pale undersides, 1,000 silver flashes in the twilight, like the turning pages of a forgotten book. It was a wind that seemed to listen, to pause at each window, and in its passage, the street fell into a deeper silence, a held breath. On this street of identical, comfortable houses, color was a statement. Gaston Abernathy's statement was a 1972 Pontiac Firebird, the color of a fresh arterial spray. He washed it every Saturday with a ritualistic care, the soap suds sliding like fat over its gleaming curves. He did not notice at first the peculiar way the wind seemed to avoid his driveway, how the leaves piled in damp mounds against his neighbor's sedan, but left a perfect, unsettling circle of bare asphalt around his car. He only felt a vague pride, a sense of his own possession standing out against the beige and sage-green backdrop of the lane. Frida Marlowe's statement was quieter, woven into the fabric of her life. A crimson thread in a gray sweater. A single ceramic bowl glazed the deep red of old wine on her kitchen table. A library book with a scarlet spine. She was a botanist, and she found the color in nature, in the veined heart of a poppy, the shocking flash of a cardinal's wing. To remove red, she felt, was to go blind to a fundamental frequency of the world. When the first whispers began, old Mrs. Gable's red geraniums found shredded, a child's little red wagon twisted into a metallic knot at the bottom of a ravine. Frida simply brought her red bowl in from the windowsill. A precaution, not a surrender. The omens were not violent. Not at first. They were corrections. A delivery van, painted a cheerful candy apple, was found one morning dusted with a fine flour-like rust that would not wash off, leaching the color to a dull, scabrous brown. A teenager's red sneakers, left on the porch, were meticulously unlaced and arranged in a neat, pointless tangle, the laces frayed as if chewed. The wind was often present after these events, smelling now not of rain, but of ozone and cold metal. Gaston laughed it off, a neighborhood prank, a collective oddity. He polished the Firebird until he could see his own wide, skeptical face in the fender. Then, one night, he awoke to a sound. Not a crash, but a sigh. A long, scraping sigh against metal. He rushed to the window. The moon was high and cold. His car was there, but it was wrong. It was being dulled. A shadow, no, a density, a patch of absolute stillness darker than the night, was moving over the hood in slow, languid passes. Where it moved, the brilliant red died into a flat, non-reflective black, not scratched, not removed, but erased. He pounded on the glass, shouting, and the density paused. It did not look at him. It had no face, no eyes, but he felt a regard, a cold, impersonal attention that froze the shout in his throat. Then it flowed off the car, across the lawn, and was gone into the deeper shadows between the houses. The wind rose, moaning softly in the gutters. The next morning, half his car was the color of a void. The line between the red and the black was not a crack or a seam, but a perfect, impossible division, as if two separate realities had been glued together. The black side was not painted. It was an absence. It drank the light. He threw a tarpaulin over it, his hands shaking, and from behind her curtains, Frida watched him. She went to her cupboard and took out the red bowl. She held it, feeling the cool, smooth curve. She did not put it away. The street learned the rules through a terrible, accumulating grammar. Red things were not stolen. They were unmade. A crimson mailbox became a lump of lead-heavy, colorless clay. A woman's ruby pendant was found as a gray pebble on her pillow. The entity was not always seen, but it was felt. A drop in temperature, a smell of wet stone, a pressure in the inner ear that made the world sound muffled and far away. And always after, the wind, cleaning the scene with its indifferent breath. Frida became an archivist of the phenomenon. She sat at her kitchen table, the red bowl before her like a talisman, and wrote in a neat, precise hand in a black notebook. She noted the attacks were not random. They followed a pattern of intensification, a narrowing focus. It was studying the color, hating it with a meticulous, scholarly loathing. She began to see it from the corner of her eye, at the golden hour when the sun bled out across the sky. It would manifest as a distortion in the air, a heat haze mirage that drank the red from the sunset, leaving a band of sickly yellow and bruised purple in its wake. It was learning to consume the color from the very light itself. The revelation came not with a bang, but in the quiet of the public library's local history section. Frida, seeking any pattern, any reason, traced her finger down microfiche of old newspapers. And she found it. A small, tragic article from 1957. A young woman, Lara Voss, found in the ravine at the end of Sycamore Lane, then a dirt track. The suspect, her jealous lover, a man named Channing Moss, was questioned, but released for lack of evidence. The only detail the article gave of what Lara was wearing was a bright red wool coat, a gift from Channing himself, bought, the article implied, with money he'd stolen from her. Channing Moss had vanished. The house he'd lived in was 3 lots down from Frida's. I understood. The entity was not vengeful in a human way. It was not seeking Channing. It had been murdered by the red, betrayed by the gaudy symbol of a false love. Its fury was existential. It was waging a war on the color itself, trying to scour it from the world that had hosted such a crime. She took her findings to Gaston, who now spent his days in a darkened living room, the tarpaulin-clad hulk of his car a monstrous silhouette in his garage. He listened, his face pale and doughy. "So what?" he mumbled. "It's a ghost. You can't reason with it." "We're not trying to reason," Frida said, her voice low and intense. "We're trying to understand the wound. The wound is red. It's trying to cauterize the world." "Then let it," Gaston cried, his voice cracking. "I'll paint my car blue. I'll burn every red thing I own." "It's too late for that," Frida said, looking out his window. "It's tasted the red here. It's rooted in. Hiding the color just makes it hunt harder. It needs to be sated." She had a plan. A terrible final plan. She went home and gathered every red object she had hidden away. The thread, the book, a scarf, a painted tile. She laid them in the center of her living room floor. Then she put on a cardigan, not red, but a deep neutral charcoal. She waited for dusk. In the ravine, the air was still and cold. She arranged her red items on a flat stone, a small, pathetic pyre of color. She stepped back and called out, not a name, but a feeling into the gathering dark. "Here. It's here. The red you hate." The temperature plummeted. The sound died. From between the trees, the entity condensed. It was not a shape, but a concentration of wrongness, a walking stain on perception. It moved toward the little pile of red, and the colors seemed to bleach and wither before it even touched them, the scarf graying, the tile chalking over. It was a consumption, a silent, voracious feasting. And then Frida revealed the final item. From her pocket, she drew the red ceramic bowl. She did not throw it. She held it high, a chalice of brilliant, defiant crimson under the last green light of the sky. The entity halted. It turned from the now colorless rubble on the stone. It focused on her, and the regard was no longer impersonal. It was a needle of pure glacial hate directed at the heart of the color, and at the hand that held it. It flowed toward her, faster now, a cloud of annihilating darkness. Frida did not run. She whispered, "Channing is here." She turned the bowl over. Taped to its underside was a driver's license, decades old, and a recent photo she'd secretly taken of old Mr. Channing, who lived under the name Charles Niles in the faded blue house at the lane's end, who tended his colorless garden with trembling hands. She had pieced it together, the reclusive neighbor, the age, the fear in his eyes whenever a police car passed. She threw the bowl, not at the entity, but toward the edge of the ravine, toward the path that led up to Channing's backyard. It shattered against a tree trunk with a sharp ceramic cry. The entity shuddered. It did not follow the physical bowl. It followed the idea. The red had been a symbol. Now, the source of the symbol was offered. The murderer, the one who had wielded the red coat like a weapon, who had clothed his violence in that vibrant hue. The entity's hatred, vast and directionless for decades, found a true north. With a sound like 1,000 sheets of paper tearing, it streamed away from Frida. Up the ravine bank, a tsunami of silent fury aimed at a single final point of origin. Frida collapsed, the cold mud seeping through her clothes. She heard no scream from Channing's house, only a profound, utter silence, deeper than any the street had ever known, followed by a single brief gust of wind that smelled finally of nothing at all. The next morning, Sycamore Lane was quiet. The wind was gentle, carrying only the scent of cut grass. Gaston, emboldened by the silence, peeked under his tarpaulin. The black half of his car remained, a permanent scar. But the red half was just red again, faded, ordinary. He wept with relief. Frida walked the street. Every red thing that had been spared. A faded flag, a child's toy forgotten in a bush, the cardinal flashing past, seemed muted, as if seen through a thin layer of ash. At the end of the lane, Channing's house stood empty, the back door swinging on its hinges. Inside, there was no sign of struggle, only a profound sense of absence, and in the center of the dusty living room floor, a single perfect circle of clean, bare floorboards, as if something had stood there and absorbed all the dust, all the history, all the life. That evening, Frida sat on her porch. The sunset bled across the horizon, a spectacular display of orange and gold. But where the red should have been, where the clouds should have burned crimson and magenta, there was a band of hollow, colorless gray. The entity was gone, sated or completed. But it had done its work. It had eaten the red from the world, starting here, in this quiet place. And the infection of its absence was spreading. The wind picked up again. A soft, steady breeze from the east. It moved through Frida's hair, across the dull green lawns, over the ravine where it had all begun. It did not whisper anymore. It simply passed through, a vast empty exhale over a landscape that had been forever sanitized of a primary color. The gray of the sky deepened, bleeding into the purple of twilight, and the wind carried that grayness down like a gentle, final shroud, covering the houses, the trees, the people inside, until every light, every memory of warmth, every last echo of a scarlet thread or a cardinal's wing was swallowed by a serene and terrible muck. The world was quieter now, and it would never be whole again. Frida sat on her porch for a long time, watching the gray settle into the bones of the evening. The streetlights flickered on, their usual orange glow now a pallid, sickly yellow. She went inside and closed the door, but the gray followed. It was in the way her plants looked, their greens now muted and dusty. It was in her own reflection, in the dark window glass, her lips pale, the life drained from her face. Days passed. The neighborhood, cautiously, tried to return to normal. Children were allowed to play outside again, though their laughter sounded thin. Gaston tried to sell his Firebird, but no one would take it. The permanent black half was a horror, a story no one wanted parked in their driveway. He finally paid a scrapyard to haul it away, and he watched it go with a mixture of grief and profound relief. He painted his front door a cheerful blue, but the blue looked wrong against the ashen air. Too loud, too desperate. Frida's work suffered. In her laboratory, under the sterile white lights, the reds in her plant specimens seemed dull, unconvincing, as if they were painted on. She found herself staring at spectral charts, at the precise wavelength of red light, feeling a hollow ache. It was a phantom limb sensation, but for a color. She missed it with a physical intensity that surprised her. She began to notice other absences. The tomatoes in her garden ripened to a muddy orange. The roses on the trellis bloomed in shades of bone and faded lavender. At first she thought it was a trick of the light, a personal melancholy coloring her perception. But then Mrs. Gable, 2 doors down, complained that her famous strawberry jam had come out a strange brown this year, though the recipe was unchanged. The fire department's new truck arrived, and it was a deep, unsettling maroon that no one could explain. The order had been for classic red. The gray was not a pigment. It was a filter. It was a slow, pervasive draining, a leaching of a specific frequency from the very light that fell on Sycamore Lane. The entity was gone, but its final focused act of hatred had left a wound in the fabric of the place, a scar that bled grayness. Frida returned to the ravine. The stone where she had laid her offerings was clean, as if sandblasted. The shards of her red bowl were gone. She walked to the spot where Alara Voss had died. It was just a patch of ferns and damp leaf litter, but when she knelt and looked closely, she saw that the few autumn leaves that had fallen there were colorless, transparent as old parchment, their veins like ghostly maps. She understood then that the entity had not just been sated by consuming Channing. It had fulfilled its purpose. It had connected the source of its pain, the murderer, with the symbol of its pain, the color. In that final convergence, it had achieved a kind of perfect, terrible closure, and in doing so, it had etched its negation of red into the very history of the land. The lane was cursed, not with a presence, but with an absence, a void where a color used to be. One afternoon, a moving van arrived at Channing's old house. A young couple with a baby was moving in. They were thrilled with the quiet street, the big backyard. Frida watched them from her window, a knot of dread in her stomach. They unloaded a bright red tricycle. The father set it on the front lawn. In the flat, gray-tinted sunlight, it looked garish and impossibly brave, like a single flower blooming on a battlefield. That night, Frida was woken not by a sound, but by a sensation, a familiar pressure in her ears, a muffling of the world. She went to the window. The moon was out, casting silver and black shadows. The red tricycle was still on the new family's lawn, and standing beside it, motionless, was a figure. It was not the entity. It was shaped like a man, but made of the same absolute light-drinking black that had claimed half of Gaston's car. It was just standing there, a cutout of nothingness in the shape of a person, one hand resting lightly on the tricycle's handlebar. As she watched, the red of the tricycle began to fade, not in a rush, but slowly, steadily, like a drop of blood diffusing in water, bleeding into the blackness of the figure's touch until the entire toy was a uniform, matte gray. The figure then turned its head. It had no face, but Frida knew it was looking toward Channing's old house, toward the new family sleeping inside, innocent bearers of the hated hue. It was not the original entity. That was gone. This was something new, a residue, an echo of the hatred given form by the lasting vacancy the entity had left behind. The wound was not healing. It was replicating. Frida stepped back from the window, her heart a cold drum in her chest. The war was not over. It had simply entered a new, more insidious phase. The color was not just being hunted, it was being remembered into oblivion. And she, the archivist, was perhaps the only one who saw the true scope of the fading. She looked at her own hands, pale in the moonlight. She thought of the crimson thread still tucked in her sewing box, a secret she had kept. It was no longer a talisman. It was a target, and a responsibility. The gray wind was rising again, and this time it had a shape. The next morning, the tricycle was a statue of dull pewter, frozen in place on the dewy grass. The young father kicked it with his foot, perplexed, and the metal crumbled into a fine, odorless powder. He swept it up, muttering about cheap imports. Frida did not correct him. She watched from her porch as the powder was dumped into a trash bin, a small grave of what once was vibrant. Her black notebook was nearly full. She opened it to a fresh page, but her pen hovered. What was there to document now? The phenomenon had evolved from a haunting into a climate. The gray was becoming endemic. She closed the book and instead took out the spool of crimson thread. She held it in her palm, a tiny, defiant coil of warmth in a cooling world. It was not just a target. It was a seed. The idea came to her slowly, a desperate botany. If the absence could replicate, could the presence? Not by hiding, but by cultivating. The entity had been a scholar of loathing. She would become a scholar of revival, but not with grand gestures. Grand gestures were consumed. This would be a quiet, cellular resistance. She began in her own garden. She planted holly berries, chili peppers, cardinal flowers, anything known for its relentless red. She watched them sprout, grow, and inevitably, as they reached their moment of color, they would falter. The berries turned to translucent pink, the peppers a wan yellow, the flowers a bleached coral. The gray filter was too strong. It was in the soil, the water, the air. Frida adjusted her methods. She built a small greenhouse from old window panes, not to keep things out, but to keep something in. She painted the interior walls, the shelves, even the dirt pots, with a primer of pure white. She installed a special grow light, one whose spectrum she modified with great care, amplifying the red wavelengths, trying to compensate for the theft outside. She planted a single scarlet runner bean in the center. Under the artificial sun, the bean flourished. It climbed, it leafed, and finally, it produced a blossom. A true, shocking and incendiary red. Frida cried when she saw it. It was a tiny, fragile victory in her glass-walled fortress. But when she tried to open the greenhouse door to let in a breeze, the blossom visibly dimmed, as if breathing the outside air was a poison. Her red was a hothouse flower, an invalid. It could not survive in the wild world of Sycamore Lane. Meanwhile, the gray echoes continued. They were sporadic, but each was a lesson. A visiting grandmother's red hat was plucked from her head by a gust of wind that smelled of dust and was found, colorless, on a telephone wire. A boy's balloon, bright cherry, simply popped for no reason, leaving not shreds of latex, but a sprinkle of gray dust on his fingers. The echoes were learning too. They were no longer just consuming red objects. They were preempting red moments. They were editing the possibility of the color from the future. Gaston came to see her one evening, his face drawn. "My kid," he said, his voice rough. She drew a picture at school. A sun. She used a yellow crayon, but she told the teacher the sun was red in her head. The teacher said she was confused, but she's not confused, Frida. She's remembering. She's 3 years old, and she's remembering a color she's never properly seen. Frida looked at the thread in her hand, then at the fragile blossom in the greenhouse. Isolating the color wasn't enough. It had to be remembered collectively. It had to be anchored not in objects, but in minds. That night, she did not sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with her crimson thread and a needle. She did not sew a pattern. She sewed a story. She pricked her finger and let a single drop of blood fall onto a square of white linen. Then, with the red thread, she began to embroider around it, not a picture, but a word. The word was red. She stitched it in bold, looping letters, the color stark against the white. She poured every memory she had of the color into each stitch. The fire engine of her childhood, the ripe apple, the furious beauty of a cardinal, the terrible, beautiful coat that had started it all. She made dozens of these squares. She gave them to Gaston for his daughter. She slipped one under Mrs. Gable's door. She left one in the library, tucked into a dictionary open to the relevant page. She did not sign them. They were anonymous seeds of memory, little vaccinations against the gray amnesia. The next time she saw an echo, a shade of deeper darkness pooling by the stop sign at the corner, she did not hide. She walked toward it, holding one of her embroidered squares in front of her like a lantern. The echo shivered, a ripple in the fabric of the dark. It did not advance. It seemed to study the word, the thread. For a moment, the pressure in her ears lessened. Then the echo simply dissolved, not with a gust of wind, but with a soft sigh, like a page turning. It was not a cure. The gray filter remained. The tomatoes were still orange, the roses still pale. But the word, the idea, stitched in the true color, held a power. It was a fixed point, a landmark in a fading world. The echoes, it seemed, could consume a thing, but they could not yet consume a story. Frida knows the work is never done. The gray is in the roots now. But on her porch, under the ashen sky, she embroiders another square. She is stitching a thread of memory, a tiny, persistent vein of red in a world gone pale. The wind blows, but it no longer feels like an exhale of ending. It feels like a held breath. And in that silence, the needle pushes through, pulling its vivid, impossible color behind it. Thank you for making it all the way to the end, and for joining me on another journey through our nighttime scary stories. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next tales. And to help our channel grow, wishing you a calm, peaceful good night. And I'll see you tomorrow with a brand new story.